Just done.
Recording in progress.
You're muted, Susan.
Hello, I'm Susan Craighead with the League of Women Voters of Naperville. Sundown laws restricted or forbade the presence of Black Americans in certain towns after sunset. They were not uncommon before the Civil Rights era. For a time, Naperville also had a sundown policy. This is a part of history it behooves us to remember and to think about today. Associate Professor of Criminology, Raleigh Blasdell, worked with students at North Central College to investigate the impact of such laws and policies. Raleigh?
Thank you, Susan. I am thrilled to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I have great admiration for the League of Women Voters and am appreciative for all the work that you do. As Susan mentioned, I serve as Associate Professor of Criminology and Sociology and am the chairperson for the Department of Sociology, Criminology, and Anthropology. I instruct a variety of different courses within our criminology and sociology curriculum, and a lot of the research that I conduct centers on the experiences on historically minoritized populations as well as victims of crime, and I do research on restorative justice practices as well. My academic journey includes a PhD from the University of South Florida, but I'm an Illinois native. I'm from the Springfield area originally and received both my bachelor's and master's degrees from Illinois State University. I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk about this project that I started with students several years ago. I am going to be discussing some of the research that they did, but importantly, I'm also going to be talking about why it's important that we are still discussing Naperville's history and the relevance that it continues to have on us today. So I am going to all right. Getting started. The first thing that I want to do is again reiterate that I am representing some students. This is a project that we started back in 2021. And so I proudly am listing the students' names up here. And I want to give a little bit of background information on them because they're not here. Camille is a graduate of North Central College. She's currently a graduate student at Northwestern University. Julia Babinek graduated with her bachelor's degree from North Central, but also earned her master's degree in higher education leadership. If you follow women's sports, she was a track star here at North Central and is currently coaching track at one of the local high schools. Caitlin graduated from North Central and is currently a first-year law student at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Haven earned her bachelor's degree in social entrepreneurship, and she is a change maker. She is working at a nonprofit in Chicago and is absolutely going to change the world for the better. Tree Smith was also a standout female athlete at North Central College. She earned her bachelor's degree here and then earned 2 different master's degrees from North Central College. She earned her MBA here as well as a master's degree in organizational leadership. That was not enough, though. She is currently a JD candidate at the University of Illinois Chicago School of Law. So I had a mentor in my doctoral program told me once that you never wanted to be the smartest person in the room. And so I intentionally surrounded myself by these brilliant minds, and they inspired me as we worked on this project. And so again, this is a preliminary investigation of Naperville's history as a sundown town. And I want to tell you a little bit about how this project got started. Candace Taylor was invited to speak at North Central College during the college's MLK Week events in 2020. All right, so this was January of 2020, and it really influenced the idea of this project. When she was here, she was promoting her book, which I have up on the screen right now. I don't know Candace beyond the short conversation I had with her in January 2020. I received no royalties from this, but the book is amazing. So I have it up there for you to check out if you're interested. But she was here when there was a lot of discussion. The movie had just come out about the Green Book, and her book is about the courage that it took to actually be listed in the Green Book. And so her book was entitled The Overground Railroad, and it celebrated the stories of those who put their name in that Green Book and stood up against segregation. And it really showed the history of the Green Book and how we arrived at our present historical moment and how far we still have to go when it comes to race relations in America. And so keep in mind, this was January of 2020. And fast forward just a couple of months and the pandemic hits. And just a few months later, we have the murder of George Floyd and a number of race-related protests throughout the United States. And we experienced those in our local communities as well. And so I was home as North Central College shut down and moved to remote learning. It provided me the opportunity to read Candace's book. And I started thinking about this book and how far we still have to go when it comes to race relations. And it got me thinking about Naperville and what I was seeing and how students at North Central were sort of responding to what was going on. And it got me thinking about how our history still is impacting our present. And so fast forward, and the world starts returning to a sense of normalcy, and I had the opportunity to apply for a small internal grant through the college. And the grant was to fund faculty-led summer research projects and to involve students in these research projects. And so I was really fortunate that the project that I had proposed to look at Naperville's history as a sundown town was funded. And so with this funding, I received this grant, and with it became $730 in financial support for any supplies we might need. And I was also able to hire 5 undergraduate researchers, and they would receive a $200 a week stipend for 4 weeks. So we had 4 weeks to explore Naperville's history as a sundown town. So clearly we didn't have a lot of time. We definitely didn't have a lot of resources. But I intentionally selected 5 undergraduate researchers who all came from different academic backgrounds. I'm a criminologist by training, and so I intentionally did not select other criminologists. I wanted someone with a political science background and with a business background and with a psychology background, people who were going to be approaching this topic from different academic standings, right? And people with different areas of interest, because I wanted their knowledge to supplement my own. All right. I didn't want to go into this just thinking from my own point of reference. But I want to back up for a minute. And Susan did a great overview in the introduction about sundown towns, and I want to dig a little bit deeper. All right, I scrolled through the participants list. I'm really excited to see some students logged in here, a few of our alumni logged in here as well, and that's a special treat to see those names pulled up. But even for the community, I want to provide a little deeper understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about sundown towns. Right? So we need to go back in time. And if we think back around 1890, this point in time, white Americans established thousands of whites only sundown towns across the United States. And what this meant was that African Americans and other non-white persons could enter into these areas during the day, typically to work, but they had to leave by dusk. And what this meant was that it permitted only white individuals to rent or own property in that jurisdiction. Hence, people could enter to work, but they had to leave by the time the sun went down. What we've discovered is that there are over 200 cities or towns in Illinois, including many in the Chicagoland area, that have been confirmed to have been sundown towns. But little exists on this history, right? So Naperville's confirmed to have been a sundown town, and it remained this way until as late as the 1970s. But Naperville is not alone in this aspect. All right. Again, there's over 200 cities and towns in Illinois. This wasn't something that's unique to Naperville. There's many other sundown towns in the Chicagoland area, right? But as I mentioned, it remained this way until as late as the 1970s. But this isn't something that just ends and we're able to move on. It's not a light switch that we turn off and everything just, it is magically saved, right? It has lingering effects, and this is true in any former sundown town. And these effects are everywhere. It's unrealistic to think that these effects wouldn't persist in any former sundown town. But what's important to keep in mind is that this carryover isn't necessarily intentional. Sometimes it is, but more often than not, we don't realize that it's happening because it's so deeply embedded in our society that we think it's normal. And to those of us white folk who don't necessarily experience the direct impact of it, we have the privilege of forgetting that these issues are deeply embedded in our customs and in our social norms because we don't recognize it, because things just seem normal to us. So again, I'm really grateful for this invitation. Number one, it allows me to brag on my students and show off some of their achievements. And it allows for these discussions and collaborations about research. But this also helps us to understand our past. And in doing that, it helps us to be able to analyze contemporary issues, and these contemporary issues that are very common in many former sundown towns. Issues like housing segregation, issues like economic disparities, racially biased policing, and more, all of which have their roots in these historical exclusionary practices. And so these are really powerful teaching tools that are going to help us really critically evaluate these historical narratives that are related to race. So as we move through, I'll pause throughout and see if there's opportunities for discussions or questions. I do want to be mindful of time to make sure that we can get through sort of the talking points that I have and save some time for questions at the end. With that, as I mentioned, I wanted students from different backgrounds so they could sort of drive the projects toward their own interests. Each of the 5 students chose an area to research that was related to those own interests. The first one was really looking at the role of faith and religious organizations, particularly the role of Black churches in racial history and in current practices. The second student wanted to explore how Naperville's laws and policies had historically impacted Black communities and whether this continued to impede racial progress. Third, another student wanted to look at zoning practices and how this impacted different sociodemographic populations. The next wanted to understand the challenges of Black business owners in a community that was predominantly white. And finally, the last student wanted to look at Naperville's public school system and what the school system was doing to address different educational issues regarding racism and inequality. I want to kick things off by looking at that first topic, because when we're looking at this first topic, it enables us to have a better understanding of all of these other 4 subsequent areas that these students were interested in. It's really important before we get into this to have an appreciation for the role that religion has played in different liberation movements throughout history and still throughout present day. This can be traced back to times of slavery, right? We know from historical records that white enslavers used religion to control and to manipulate enslaved Blacks, and Black people used faith for liberation, right? What's really, really interesting about this is we know that political activists have debated whether the role of the Black embrace of Christianity under slavery was a positive or negative force. And this is a really curious debate because there's people who argue that the Black church actually gave oppressed persons this false comfort and hope, and it obscured the causes of their oppression, and it really reduced their ability to be able to overturn that oppression. But when we dig into it, religion didn't function in that simple fashion in the history of Black persons in this country, because we can trace the role of the Black church as having this long and noble history in relation to Black political action that dates back at least to the late 18th century. And we can look at this extraordinary resilience of the African American community under slavery and look at the sheer will and determination of these men and women to live to see another day and to thrive. And if we think about the number of Africans who were dragged to North America during the slave trade and then sustained while enslaved and torn away from their families and enduring this cruelty that I cannot even imagine without giving up hope. And during this time, neither hope nor Black culture died. In fact, they were nurtured in the Black church. And this is so intertwined with Black political action. And indeed, this was apparent to the civil rights movement and subsequently to the Black Lives Matters movement. And if we trace it back and we recognize the role of religion, and particularly the role that the Black church played, there would be no Civil Rights Act, there would be no Voting Rights Act without the Black church. So the student was interested in Naperville. How did religion, was there an impact of the Black church in Naperville, either during the period of sundown towns, in further liberation movement? And so you're probably not shocked to hear that Naperville has never had Black churches. But there have been institutions, religious institutions, that have been very intentional in addressing racial discrimination in Naperville, and very intentional in playing a role in these liberation movements. The students, for example, found very impressive records outlining activities from the First Congregational United Church of Christ in these intentional, ongoing efforts to acknowledge discrimination and to be anti-discriminatory in their practices. There are other churches as well who have been really intentional in trying to be involved in these liberation movements. But what's important to keep in mind is that sundown towns weren't only exclusionary of Blacks, but other minoritized groups as well. And so when the students were looking at Naperville's history as a sundown town and how that might continue to impact present practices, the students noticed interesting links regarding difficulties encountered when the proposal was first brought forth for the new Mosque and Islamic Center. And when the students were reviewing some of the concerns, people had some really legitimate concerns in terms of the size and the scale and traffic concerns. And it became evident that there were some very legitimate community concerns. It also became very evident that there were concerns that were disguised as legitimate concerns, and there were other concerns that were outright discriminatory. They compared this proposal to other proposals, and they didn't quite see the same opposition, though admittedly it's hard to make direct comparisons to different areas, as well as, again, the size and the scale of the proposals weren't necessarily comparable. But the students still have some unanswered questions, and this is where you all can come in and you might be helpful as well. The students came across some oral histories regarding the Saints Peter and Paul Church that was destroyed in the 20s. And there are conflicting stories about a Klan rally that was the same night in Plainfield and whether or not that might be linked to the burning. There's other recounts of a church that had a depiction of a Black individual in one of its stained glass windows, and maybe that's why it was burned. And the students weren't able to see if this had actually ever really been confirmed. And if so, if that church has ever been involved in any, modern liberation movements. And so this is something that's still to be continued. And I think some of you who might have more community knowledge than we do, or might have more connections, could be helpful in sort of moving those conversations forward. And the other thing that's still sort of left unknown is the role of surrounding communities. Did Black churches or liberation-related churches in surrounding areas affect the culture of Naperville in any other ways? So this is sort of the next area for this religion and liberation related research. So I think this is a time that I've been talking for a minute, and I certainly want this to be a discussion. So I'll pause here if there's any discussion in the chat box, or if anyone has any additional insight here that you're willing to share, if there's any additional discussion so far before I move on to the next area of inquiry from our students.
There's nothing in the chat right now, but
Okay.
people should feel free to speak up, raise their hands, speak up if you want to add something.
Or anything else that might be related so far. I'm seeing Seeing none? Keep thinking about it. I'll give you plenty of time to ask more questions later or jot down some thoughts, and I'll open it back up at the end as well. All right, that's fine. We'll move on to the next section then. We had two of the students who were involved in this process went on to law school, so it should not surprise you that we had students who were interested in law and policy. And one of the findings is they were looking at different laws and policies that might have reinforced Naperville's status as a sundown town. There were some oral histories that suggested that Naperville might have had this mandatory curfew. Again, that mandatory curfew being that non-white individuals had to be out of the city limits, before the sun went down. There is record of discriminatory real estate practices that existed, essentially barring Black persons from either renting or owning homes in Naperville. We also know, again, there's public records of Naperville being cited for not meeting the standards of the Fair Housing Act. And so what sort of remains unknown, though, or things that we're still curious about, is whether or not formal written policies existed, right? What we're sort of seeing conflicting records on is whether or not there actually were formal written policies or whether or not Naperville was an informal sundown town. And so what it means to be an informal sundown town is that there weren't official written policies, but rather the community set the norms, right? That sort of maintained this whites only town and didn't have formal written rules. However, there was one oral history that we came across that suggested that there was documentation, but that it had been intentionally destroyed. But we weren't able to find any confirmation that that actually took place. So that sort of remains unknown, whether or not there was an official sort of written curfew or if that was something that, again, was just sort of informally something that the community enforced. And if there were written policies that were intentionally destroyed. I'll pause here. Is there any community knowledge here or stories that anyone has heard here regarding how the practice of maintaining a sundown town occurred in Naperville, whether there were written policies or whether there's been records of policies being destroyed? Or suggestions of where to look for these records? All right, think it over. I'm going to be reaching out to you for assistance. So think it through. Let me know if you have some ideas. Moving on to looking at zoning and housing. In June 2021, the Elmhurst Art Museum had a really lovely exhibit on fair housing. And so you see three of the students, in the picture on the right-hand side here, you see three of the students were able to, with part of our $730 budget, we were able to go to the fair housing exhibit there. It was the following year that Naper's Settlement had the Unvarnished exhibition. That was just brilliant. And I believe they're doing a pop-up exhibition now for Black History Month. And Naper's Settlement also has a really lovely online exhibition from that Unvarnished exhibition that looks at fair housing and discriminatory practices as well. So if you haven't checked that out, definitely do. It's fantastic. But one thing that the students wanted to look at were sort of these socioeconomic and racial divides. And there are distinct socioeconomic and racial and ethnic divides with regard to residential areas. There are lower income housing areas that predominantly tend to be occupied by Black residents. The city's DEI website has some really, really pool resources. So this project was launched just shortly after Dr. Williams was hired to spearhead the number of different DEI initiatives for the city of Naperville. And since she's come on board, there's been incredible resources that have been made available to the public. One of which I have on this slide for you, and this is modern, this is recent, like as of the last week data. This is on the City of Naperville's website. This is the Race and Ethnicity Atlas. This is where different groups are located in the city of Naperville. And so what you see on the left-hand side of your screen is a map of Naperville that outlines where white residents reside. The darker green areas are areas that are more highly concentrated with white residents, and the lighter green areas are areas that are more sparsely concentrated with white residents. On the right-hand side of your screen, this is where Black or African American residents reside. Again, the darker areas represent higher concentrations of Black residents, and the lighter, is that orange? Lighter orange color, salmon color, represents areas that are less populated by Black or African American residents. And you can see that these areas are almost completely flipped with one another, right? So what's really interesting is these dark green colors are almost the very light, sparsely populated areas with regard to where Black and African American residents live. And so we had concluded on our own 4 years ago that based on our own research, we saw that this was a practice. Fast forward 4 years, we're seeing that this still tends to be a trend in the city of Naperville. We wanted to examine other former sundown towns 4 years ago to see if this was a common theme. And what's really interesting here is that it was a common theme with some, but not all. Some cities, Oak Park is a really good example of a city that's not like this. What Oak Park did is that it was very intentional when it was desegregating, because Oak Park is a former sundown town. And when it was desegregating, it was very intentional in implementing strategic zoning practices to avoid having areas that isolated much of the housing. Of isolating housing that tends to be the most affordable and thereby housing more Black and racial and ethnic minority residents, because we know there's a relationship between socioeconomic status and race and ethnicity. And so students spent a lot of time discussing how practices that the city of Naperville implemented that weren't as strategic in their zoning practices seems to have resulted in a city that essentially was desegregated, but is still yet to become fully integrated. Right? I thought that was really profound that one of the students said, it's like Naperville has become desegregated, but it's not yet fully integrated. We spent a lot of time out and moving around in these different areas in the city. And as we were exploring these areas and what was going on in these different areas, it became evident that the population and resources in these different areas were different, but we started noticing other distinct features about these different areas within Naperville. And one area that I didn't pick up on, but the students recognized, was that the parks in different parts of Naperville were very, very different. Naperville had, at that time, 173 public parks, which is amazing, an incredible park district. And the students just sort of, as we were moving around, said the parks are different in different parts of the city. And so we went to the Naperville Park District's website and we plotted a grid over the map that was on their website of that time. And we plotted this equal grid, and then we randomly selected parks from each cluster on that grid. And then we went to each of those parks. And in going to each of the parks that we'd randomly selected, because we We only had 4 weeks and $730, so we couldn't go to all 173 parks. But the parks that we'd randomly selected from across the city of Naperville, we were assessing for neighborhood characteristics and the size of the park and design characteristics and different amenities that were at the park. And so you see here, 4 of the student researchers were at one of the parks in Naperville, and they insisted that they needed to test the equipment to make sure it was working properly. So this was a really fun day for the students and fun day for me to watch them having a good time as well. But what they started to notice is that parks that were in some of the more affluent areas were generally larger and they tended to have more amenities. They also noted that some of the areas that were marked as parks, in some of the more, not necessarily lower income areas, but in more of the areas that had apartment complexes and multi-resident housing, tended to be sort of open fields that didn't have a lot of amenities. They didn't have equipment like what you're seeing on the screen right now. So they were great for if people wanted to bring their own equipment and play sports, but it's also operating under the assumption that people have equipment to take to those areas. What was also interesting that the students noticed was that they noticed that Naperville utilizes what's referred to as hostile architecture. This is an example of hostile architecture. It's what's called a tiered bench. And these are benches that have these bars in between the seats that make it hard for someone to lay down or rest. And they're typically used to prevent people from sleeping, discouraging loitering, but especially used to prevent unhoused persons from using that space. And so this was another interesting observation that the students made in terms of these strategies being used in these park areas. All right, I have...
Yep, there are several comments
Yes,
in the chat.
I just
Rachel.
looked over at the chat box. Let me, yeah, this is a
Hey,
good
are you
time
going to go through them?
to pause. Let me see these. Yes, I like it. Suggestions about city ordinances and the information at Naper Settlement. Yes, absolutely. Remember a 6 p.m. siren or whistle, informally a sundown warning. Very interesting. Thank you, Sandra. Does anyone else remember that? I'll have to look into that. Freemasonry in sundown towns, very interesting. Thank you, Mary Lou. I hadn't thought of that role, but definitely something worth exploring. Looking at the Park District's master plan, no, that's not somewhere where we have been yet, but certainly in terms of the next step and better understanding and making sense of this, that would definitely be something to include in our next step. Comfort and safety is another aspect. Sure. Okay. Does anyone have any other questions or questions that are easier to unmute and ask? For anyone who's on their mobile device and it's harder to scan over and type in a question, if you'd rather ask by unmuting.
Dr. Blasdell, there was one comment about house deeds existing in the Chicago area that don't allow Black people to buy properties. Do your students, did they find if there were any in Naperville?
There is record of this. There is documentation of this, and there are also oral histories from the 60s of Black persons who were attempting to buy houses in Naperville, and realtors formally telling them that that was not an option. But yes, that is definitely, Julie, that is definitely something worth looking into to see if it was like a formally written practice versus, again, if it was more informal, that the community just sort of organized and enforced on their own.
What would be informal?
So yeah, that's a great question, Eddie. Informal practices are where the community really enforces these norms and practices on their own without them formally being written down as policies. And so it's just sort of the community practice that are just sort of enforced and known on their own rather than actually be formally written down as laws or formal policies.
And does that mean can be included in their deed?
Not necessarily. So again, it might not formally be written down in there, but it might be something that is informally practiced and known.
My
Even
deed has that language in it.
oh, it does.
Yes.
Okay, I would be very interested in talking to you more and hearing more about that.
As a matter of fact, I just came from the county yesterday and had it redacted from my deed.
Fascinating. Okay. All
We
right.
need to talk.
We do need to talk. You're absolutely right. Thank you for letting me know. Yes, I'm going to have some contact information up at the end. So I'll share that, but if you want to provide me yours at the end, if that's easier, I'm happy to arrange that.
Yes,
Thank you.
the league a couple of years ago learned about this, and we actually sort of publicly encouraged people to look at their deeds from a certain period of time. And now you can go to the county and redact it. They used to charge you, but Eddie, I don't think they charged you, did they?
I told them that I would not pay for it and that they had to. Uh, I did. They did it and act without any fees.
Yeah, they used to charge you
And
10
we
or
just had the documentation yesterday.
yeah, they used to charge you 10 or $15 to do that.
Well,
I don't think they're
that
allowed to
is for
charge you anymore. I think the county changed that.
no, Liz Chaplin and I changed it 2 days ago.
Right, great.
Thank you, Eddie. Yeah, that's interesting. And so that would make it more of a formal policy then in the sense from a real estate perspective. Yeah.
And I could also go a little step further and say that my neighbor has had his redacted, and I do believe the entire sex neighborhood has that language in every one of the deeds in the sex.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, we definitely need to talk. Thank you. All right. The next area that we looked at, this is a student who was studying business, was interested in Black-owned businesses in the city of Naperville. And I believe the census data at the time, it was 4.5%, maybe 5% of the population of Naperville was Black. And so might not be surprising that we had a really difficult time locating Black-owned businesses in Naperville. There were and continue to be a few salons and hair studios and a couple of locally owned restaurants. We went looking. We were on the hunt. We had that $730 and we'd set apart some of it to support locally owned businesses. And what was interesting is that when we located Black-owned businesses, only one of them was promoting itself as a Black-owned business. And this is something really unique because in the business world, this has become quite a strategy in promoting yourself as a Black-owned business, as a marketing tool. And there are entire websites and social media sites that are devoted towards supporting and promoting Black-owned businesses. But what was really interesting is that the few that we were able to find in the city of Naperville, of those, only one was actually promoting itself as a Black-owned business. Interestingly, that was a locally owned restaurant. We tried to visit on a couple of different occasions, and it was closed when we went. Keep in mind, this was post-pandemic when a lot of local eateries were really struggling, and again, especially small family-owned businesses. So again, we weren't holding that against the restaurant at all. Again, those that we found were not in traditionally kind of busy commercial areas. And so the fact that we couldn't find a lot of information. We couldn't find a lot of Black-owned businesses, and we couldn't find a lot of information on those that did exist, and that those that did exist weren't promoting themselves as Black-owned businesses was sort of telling and interesting information in itself. But when we were researching this, we were left with a lot more questions than we found answers. So we were really curious. Are there more that exist that we just can't find because potentially it's not beneficial in the city of Naperville to promote your business as a Black-owned business? Is that something that's not an effective business strategy in the city of Naperville? Is it simply supply and demand? And because there's such a small percentage of residents who are Black, that there's just simply not a demand for Black-owned businesses? I mean, certainly there are residents who want to support Black-owned businesses regardless, but, is it that there's just still not large enough demand? Or is it the possibility that business owners are deterred by sort of the history of Naperville, and that there are other locations that are sort of more conducive to opening their businesses? We don't know the answers to these questions. And so this is an area that we're really curious to explore more. And so reaching out to current business owners, reaching out to Black business owners in surrounding areas, and really trying to get an idea and better understand sort of what's going on here, because we have a lot more questions here than we have answers. The final area that we looked at were public schools, and we didn't get into this area as much as we would have liked to. One of the areas that we were able to look at, and it's again just information that was really public record, we were able to look at the teaching staff, looking at the high schools at this point in time. Naperville North and Central both had teaching staff that was, I think it was 92% white and like 1 or 2% Black. Nequa had a slightly higher percentage of Black teachers. I think maybe it was a 3% of their teachers were Black. This is worth noting because lack of representation in teaching staff affects the learning and opportunities for all students. And so we know that students suffer disadvantages if they aren't exposed to different types of representation in the classroom. And so we didn't get in a lot more detail in that, other than just seeing basic demographics of their teaching staff. That's not to say that their teachers aren't doing an amazing job, but again, we know the importance of representation, and we know the importance of being exposed to different racial and ethnic perspectives. One thing that was really interesting, though, and something that I never would have thought of, is this student had been really involved in the arts. And so she looked into their arts programs, particularly in their performing arts. And she was exploring their theater programs and the theater productions that the schools had put on over the previous years. And on the websites, you could see the different theater productions they'd put on over the last few years. And what was really, really interesting here is that the theater programs, and again, she did a deep dive into this, is that the theater productions tended to follow a relatively Eurocentric approach, and that most of the programs included productions that were by white playwrights. In our discussions, we acknowledged that it could be because of student populations. A lot of plays that are written by Black playwrights have Black characters, and with a small percentage of Black families and Black students in Naperville, it might could present a casting, issue. We're certainly not going to put white students in blackface to play these characters. But it was something interesting that she pointed out that, again, I wouldn't have thought of, but she said, when you have schools that don't have a lot of representation, arts are a good way to expose students to different populations and to different experiences. And so I thought it was sort of interesting that this is something that she had pointed out and mentioned that it could be a way for schools to incorporate more diverse perspectives. What we don't know and what we didn't have a chance to get into is whether or not the curriculum includes discussions of Naperville's history as being a sundown town, and why that's important to discuss. What the experiences of Black students and faculty and staff are in our Naperville public schools. And again, this is sort of the last topic that we got to, and we didn't have a chance to get into these in a lot of detail. So what's next? All right. What we've done so far just skimmed the surface, and it opened up the door for a big project to follow. Our next step is doing interviews and oral history interviews and talking to people who have experiences and talking to people who can provide a lot more information and who know these histories. And so we are interested in talking to current and former residents. Eddie, people like you. We're interested in talking to town experts. Every town has its own town historians, formal or informal town historians. We're interested in getting in contact with them and being able to talk to them and learn from them. Longtime and retired realtors. All right, realtors know the ins and outs and everyone within a community, and so they're a great resource. Members of clergy as well, just to get, again, knowing the impact that religion and clergy have on different members of our community. They can also provide quite a bit of reference, and they're also great historical references as well. And as I mentioned, business owners, just to get a better sense of the lack of Black-owned businesses here, and to try and better understand how to better support Black businesses here, and how to attract more Black business owners to Naperville. In addition to that, as a criminologist, I am especially interested in historical policing practices and the way that the Sundown town history impacted policing practices throughout history. We know that it's inevitable that it would have happened. It's nothing that's Naperville specific. We see it around the country. And so eventually at some point also sort of doing a deep dive throughout police archives and seeing if there's sort of links between historical police practices and how we might see those linked to Naperville's history as well. So again, why are we doing this? A lot of people are reluctant to discuss discriminatory history. They see it as sort of historic practices that we don't need to revisit. Students were really surprised as we were reviewing some city records to see that some elected officials were unwilling to acknowledge Naperville's history of racial discrimination, but it's so crucial that we do so. Reluctance to acknowledge our past is really a barrier to progress. Folks ask, why can't we just move on? But, moving on without understanding our history is not moving forward. It's not moving forward at all. And so the idea that we're able to move on is really a privilege, because it means that what happened isn't impacting you. And this discussion and these ongoing discussions are so critical because it sheds light on this deeply ingrained aspect of American racism. And that's that communities as a whole actively excluded people of color through intimidations and sometimes through violence. And this is an important distinction because it acknowledges that racism wasn't something that just individuals did, but it was a collective act, right? It highlights this systemic nature of racial segregation, and it acknowledges that it occurred in places other than the South, which is sometimes people's belief as well. And so doing events like this and having these conversations and sometimes getting uncomfortable with our past is so important because it prompts this examination of ongoing present day disparities that are rooted in these historical practices. And this examination isn't just a task, it's a call to action that we all can play a role in. So, with that, I think my screen's still up. I think we still have a little bit of time. I think there were a couple more questions. If there's any other questions or comments or ideas that you have, I would love to hear them.
Yeah, from the chat, there are two more.
Yes.
John wrote that a few years ago, a friend of mine who grew up in downtown Naperville recalled an instance from the 1960s when his parents asked a Black friend to stay for dinner. The Black man, citing the Sundown town history of Naperville, declined the invitation. My friend's father, an educated man, was an employee of the Naperville Sun and might have been aware of conditions at a time. To me, this suggests that if there was a formal law at the time, it was not widely advertised. But that tells little about time before 1960. Further details of the incident are lost with the deaths of my friend in 2024. So it sounds like maybe it was a kind of a word of mouth or a community thing rather than a thing. Karen asks, did North Central have a policy regarding the sundown practice? Was there any activism around the issue? Did the college passively accept the status quo?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And to be honest with you, I don't know the answer to this because I know that, and I'm trying to see if I can pull it up. Karen, I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to look that up and get back to you at some point. And I'm writing a note down right now. I don't know the answer to that. I know that, and kind of leading into Marcia's question after that, I know that in the 60s, because I don't know when North Central first formally started admitting Black persons. And so I would imagine it likely corresponded with around that same time period. Marcia, in regard to your question, I know that Aurora had I don't want to say a large Black population, but there was a Black population in Aurora. And there's actually a story that North Central loves to tell about Dr. Martin Luther King being invited to speak at North Central in the 60s. And when he came to speak on campus, he wasn't allowed to stay in Naperville. And so he actually had to spend the night in Aurora. And I don't remember exactly what year that was, but it would have been sometime in the 60s. But what's really interesting is following that, it actually motivated students, and with some of the local churches, it organized sort of this group of activists from North Central College, and with local churches, it organized, I think it was 2 buses of students that actually went down to Selma to march and be part of some of the civil rights movement down there after hearing Dr. King speak on campus. And so North Central does have some history in terms of bringing, kind of what at the time would have been unpopular speakers to campus. But again, they were still subject to kind of the broader policies of the city of Naperville. But yes, to your question, and then also to Judy's question as well, I don't know when North Central first started admitting Black persons, as well as when Black students first started living in the dorms. So yes, I will look into that.
My nephew attended North Central
Yeah.
in mid 90s, late 80s, mid 90s.
Uh-huh.
And when you were talking about the teachers, I started teaching here in Naperville in '74, being the first Black male ever to teach
Really?
in Naperville.
Okay.
We have a lot to talk about, don't we?
Eddie, I'm going to just keep your coffee cup filled.
One more fact.
Yes.
I am the first Black Naperville Township supervisor ever.
Okay. Eddie, how long have you lived in Naperville?
74.
74. Okay.
It was 19,000 people at that time.
Okay. You've seen some changes.
Yeah.
Yes, Eddie has great stories and tremendous knowledge about Naperville and how it's changed. I've
Excellent.
certainly heard some of them.
All right. Well, I tell you what, my contact information is on the screen. My email address is up there. And I am not here to ask for any money. All right. I want to make that clear. Tomorrow is North Central's Day of Giving. And so if you are looking for ways to support the college and you feel moved to donate, the Department of Sociology, Criminology, and Anthropology, there is a way for you to do that. Do not feel obligated to do so in any way. But if you were feeling drawn to support the college, I would invite you to explore ways that your donation might help our department. But with that, feel free to follow up with me. I've written down some of your names and we'll find ways to get in touch with you. But I appreciate this invitation. You all have been fantastic. Again, thank you for those of you who spent your evening with me, and for students and some alumni who have logged in here. It's been a treat, and I appreciate you spending your evening with me when there's so many other things I know you could be doing.
And Raleigh, thank you very much. It really is interesting
Oh,
that you looked at such a broad aspects, so many parts of everyday life and what kind of impacts that had. So I'm certainly there's a lot of room for even more with your research. So thank you so much for sharing that.
absolutely. And again, I give credit to those students who are on doing amazing things right now. But again, the door is open to go so many more directions with it now. So I look forward to doing that with some of your help.
Yeah, and if anyone else, even if you were quiet tonight, if you have nice or important or fun Naperville stories, I'm sure Raleigh would be happy to hear them. So once again, I want to thank Raleigh very much for spending her evening with us and telling us some important history about Naperville. The League holds ideas forums most second or third Wednesdays of the month. On the third Wednesday of March, we'll hear from Jeannie Schultz Angel of Naples Settlement, who will speak on casting a historic vote, suffrage for women in Illinois. We have some other upcoming events. As I hope you know, there's a municipal election on Tuesday, April 1st. The League's candidate forums will be in the evening by Zoom, March 4th, March 6th, March 11th, and 12th, both school boards, the City Council, and the Park District. You can go to the League's website for registration. I'll remind you that April 1st is during the public schools spring break. So we're encouraging people to vote early if you're going to be out of town on April 1st. The League will be participating in the St. Patrick's Day Parade on Saturday, March 15th. We hope we'll have warmer weather than we have today. If you enjoyed this event and appreciate the community and civic work of the League of Women Voters of Naperville, We hope you'll consider joining us. Just go to the join page of our website. Once again, Raleigh, thank you very much, and thank you very much to all of our attendees. Good evening.